Today on our Tech for Business podcast, we are joined by Michael Collins, the Principal Consulting Solutions Architect at Barracuda. Basically, we've got the technical guy here, which we love. And then we've got Nate, our Director of Cybersecurity. So thank you so much for joining us today, both of you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about web application firewalls. And just for the purposes of this podcast, we're probably referring to it as a WAF if you don't know what that is. So Michael, maybe you can start us for listeners who are not familiar with what a WAF is. Can you tell us what it is and how it protects businesses?
Sure, that's a great question. And one of the ways that we help people to understand where a WAF fits in is to talk about a network firewall first, or the perimeter firewall that most of us are familiar with. So all of our businesses, we have a network firewall, perimeter firewall. And then when we say just firewall, that's typically what we're talking about is the Cisco or the Juniper, the Sonic Wall, all of those that we have, Meraki, things like that. And so those are protecting, when we say network firewall, much of the heavy lifting is done at the network layer and network and transport, the IP address and the port. And so those are protecting network connections going in and out, ingress and egress. But what the WAF is doing, the web application firewall, the application is important because we're talking about the application layer or layer 7. So what the WAF does, the WAF is a specialist looking at VIC at layer 7, and specifically we're looking at primarily HTTP, HTTPS traffic. So what the WAF is going to do is it's going to specialize in protecting what's inside the payload of that web traffic or the HTTP, HTTPS traffic. We like to use an analogy, is that the agent who's looking at the boarding pass and the ID, that person is making sure that packets don't get through. But let's say they do get through. Well, what does the WAF do? The WAF is very much like that scanner where we put our carry-on luggage and we have to take out our notebooks and things like that and go through the scanner. What the scanner is doing is just enforcing good behavior. Just making sure that what's going onto the plane should actually go on the plane. So the WAF is enforcing good behavior for the traffic that is coming in to our web servers. For example, if somebody does a search, go to a search page on or even a login page. This might even be a better one, is you go to a login page, making sure that people aren't doing bad things at the login page, like trying to get the server to let somebody in who shouldn't be in by doing various injection or attacks on the login page. We get a little more detailed on that, but at a high level, the web application firewall is protecting an application, whereas the network firewall is protecting the network.
Correct.
Yeah, those are some great analogies, and I really like the one that you had with the kind of the TSA, right? Is it's that scanner letting the applications and the legitimate throughs into the plane and everything. I guess one of the things I wanted to maybe take one step back on is, there's organizations that might be going, well, what application are you talking about, right? Is it my Outlook on my desktop? Is it the application on my phone? Like what defines an application? And so for the listeners, an application is some type of like web application. So this could be your website. It could be a custom application that you've developed and are hosting. So maybe you are providing services out to other organizations, or maybe you have a business to consumer application that they're accessing. One of the other things was Ariel and I were talking about this, and why we really wanted to have a conversation with Barracuda and the WAF was that the onset of all these AI generated applications that organizations are doing, right? So now that the term vibe coding, and it's kind of a little bit further, is as everyone had vibe coded all these applications, oftentimes they weren't doing the strong security controls before implementing them into production. And so you have these individuals that didn't understand, cybersecurity or the risks, or following OWASP top 10, injection attempts or anything like that. And so what they did was they went, I have a working application. Let's put this on the public facing internet and run my business. And it's great. You were able to create something that solved an issue, but inherently, maybe unknowingly, you actually introduce new risk to your business, without fully considering the implications of that. And so there's really a kind of a twofold problem to that, or kind of solution that you need to eventually address. Is you you vibe coded it in the first place, but you need to go back and vibe code it and say, start scanning all the code review, making sure that I have the strong controls in place. If you have a authentication method, so are you capturing credentials? How are you securing the login? How are you securing the database? How are you protecting against, I'm going to get a little technical, but don't worry, I'm not going to spend time on this. Are you doing things like cross script forgery requests, anything like that, right? Session token theft, anything like that, to try and prevent that. That's one component of it. Now, where it helps is that the WAF will also help protect from a lot of those built-in ones. And it's that front door that sits in front of the application. You have to validate before you let them in. And so you don't have to be the coding expert. While you should still give that the due diligence, the WAF is also there to say, Barracuda, they have been the experts in this. They have this validated. They have it tested. You have, if you don't know the code well, they have the UI where you can go in and enable certain things. You can see the logs coming in. You can see whether things are getting blocked, and then tune it accordingly to the business risk. So, like I said, just wanted to start off of going, what application are you guys even talking about here? Web apps. And what that may entail. But everyone should have, or likely has, a website. So that we'll start there, and then going from any other applications that you've custom built after that.
Yeah, Nate, you bring up a good point, because it's not always explicitly clear what an application is, right? Sometimes we have to put application and use the air quotes, application. An application could be pretty much anything on, for example, port 443 HTTPS, whether it's in a browser or not. It could be one of those apps, like you have the Starbucks app, your McDonald's app, whatever the app is on your phone. Typically, those are using web requests to talk to the back end. Well, what the bad guys are going to do is they're going to say, well, let me see how this application works. I want to see what traffic is my phone sending to the backend server. It'll sniff the traffic, they'll inspect it, and they'll see what web requests are going through. And then they could go to a computer and they could use AI, or just use some basic, like a Kali Linux or something like that, to send a lot of automated requests to a server trying to break APIs. Something that we as humans don't typically see in a browser or in an application, but under the hood, there's application traffic that's flowing to the backend server, right? That needs protection as well. So APIs are a big slice of the pie when it comes to what needs to be protected. So vibe coding is another one of those things where it's like, yeah, I'm building something, but do I see the actual traffic that's flowing through? Do I know where the traffic is coming from? I vibe code an app and I put it out there. Have I done any kind of validation to make sure only the right people are coming in? Do I want to open it to the world? Do I want to do geofencing? That's only North America that I want to allow traffic in. There's lots of questions that the vibe coder probably hasn't considered. And if that person is just trying to build an application that works, that provides the useful purpose, we can understand why all of the security things those are the interesting things when you're vibe coding, right? I don't know if you vibe coded, but I've been doing some vibe coding, and I've seen exactly what you're talking about. I built something that I want to give to people, And I've done it actually for interacting with our WAF as a service, right? We have a lot of APIs for interacting with our WAF as a service, and I built some really interesting tools. But I don't want those out on the public internet. So I've actually put those things behind the WAF. So it's interesting. I've built a web-facing application to talk to a WAF as a service that I put behind a WAF as a service. In fact, I went so far as to put a client certificate so that you can't even get to it without having a client certificate. That's another layer. It's a little bit technical, but the idea is we don't want people who shouldn't be there coming in the front door. So that's a great question. What do we know? What actually needs to be protected? Virtually anything that is receiving web requests, HTTP, HTTPS, and it doesn't have to be just on port 443 or port 80. Web servers nowadays will listen on many different ports. And if it's web traffic, chances are you should assume that you need application protection, that you need a WAF until you determine otherwise.
Before we started recording, Michael, you mentioned that there's, different kinds of WAF, but how do you determine at, what level you should have, or how, robust this WAF should be for your business?
Yeah, that's a great question, because not all web applications are equally valuable. They're not all equally, if something happened to one web application and it went down, it might not have a business impact. Whereas another one, even a minute of downtime could be very costly. It could be costly in terms of, the business impact in terms of revenue. I'm losing revenue. Or it could be costly in terms of my business reputation if something went down, right? So there's different kinds of protection that we need. For example, we have some municipalities that have just some basic information. A little bit of downtime is not really critical there. We don't want it to be defaced, but the level of security may not require enterprise grade application. Maybe just the basic, like we have a very basic level of application security. That may be sufficient. Whereas another application is maybe it's got a patient portal for a clinic or a hospital or an insurance agency, something that has sensitive information. We have the same thing with banks and credit unions that have a customer portal. Anything with sensitive data, whether it's PII, PHI, whatever that data is that's sensitive, those definitely require a higher level of security. So we like to recommend enterprise grade application security in those situations. So you're not going to get that with there are public WAFs out there, like cloud-based WAFs that you can get for $25 a month. Those are what you might consider very bare minimum. There's not a lot of bells and whistles, not a lot of customization. It's just very, very basic stuff that's protecting against the OWASP top 10 in most cases of injection and things like that. But for sophisticated bot attacks or just more coordinated attacks, denial of service attacks, those lower entry level, they call them entry level WAFs. Those they're not going to get it done, right? They're not going to supply the kind of protection that those more sensitive and critical business applications need. So yes, that's a good question about what kind of application security do you need. Do you need enterprise grade, or do you need the very, very basics? That's a good question to ask when you're coming into that, because you don't want to spend lots of money protecting just a really simple application that maybe just it's an informational website. You don't want to spend money protecting that you don't really need to, but you definitely want to invest protecting that sensitive application.
Yeah, I can also give a very practical example, the screen test. So our marketing team loves the WAF. We've implemented the WAF, here on even our main website, and there's really nothing critical up there, right? We don't have a customer portal, that we host, or any PII, PHI, anything like that. But in order to fully test and, all the controls available, within the WAF, you start tuning and tweaking and seeing, like how tight can we get this without impacting operations. And then, so kind of some practical blocks that can happen, right? They are things like our marketing team, they send out email communications and campaigns and, try and let, connect with everyone. And sometimes in those uh, link requests, they are too long, right? It has a lot of characters in that. And if you set your WAF to say only allow so many characters in the URL, it'll block it. And then the person that you're trying to get engaged into a webinar or anything like that gets well, you've been blocked, right? Which is very jarring. So for anyone that's ever seen that, I apologize. That was probably my fault here at CIT. But that's, kind of a practical thing. It could be things like you were trying to protect the login to your website. And so by restricting it to certain IPs, well, we know that, like your home networks, they periodically change IPs because, that's kind of what your IT providers do, unless you have a static IP, that you're paying for from like a business. And so as Ariel is trying to access the website from here or at a friend's house or wherever it may be, and all of a sudden she gets blocked again saying, I can't update our website. Right. So again, there's considerations that you have to put in place there. But yes, Ariel is very patient with our WAF. But we have had to relax that quite a bit. Because again, to Michael, your point is we didn't have critical data in there. How do you still allow those to flow? So
Yeah, and that's a good point, because one of the things that I feel that Barracuda's WAF does really well is to give the administrator a lot of control over fine tuning the security. So it comes down to false positive mitigation. There's a lot of things that need to be done to make sure that the security supplied by the WAF meets the needs of the specific application. There's a couple ways you could go with a WAF. There's the positive security model or the negative security model, which basically, the one way is to say, we're going to block everything except for what we explicitly allow. That's one way you do it. That's really tight. That has some pros and cons. That's a very high maintenance way to go. But if you're hypersensitive when it comes to security, that's probably something that you should consider. On the flip side, there's the other one that says, hey, we're going to look for things to block. Hey, we're going to assume positive intent when a request comes in, but we're going to examine it. We're going to look for all of these, possible attacks. So it's like there's a battery of tests for every request that comes in. And if it fails any of those tests, then we're going to block that request. And then the logs will say why it was blocked. But fine tuning is a really important point, because again, those lower end, those really, really basic entry level WAFs are not going to give the administrator very much control over the fine tuning process. I really liked your example, Nate, about, doing that. You're doing a marketing, you're doing an outreach campaign. We had an example where we were having a customer all of a sudden just get hit with all of these DDoS attacks, and it was random. So we thought. We did a little more investigating. What happened was we found out that it was happening at certain times of day. Well, somebody put two and two together and realized that the so-called DDoS attacks were happening at the same time that they were doing marketing outreach campaigns, where they were sending a lot of emails, outbound emails. Well, they had an email filtering solution that would actually look at the links inside of the body of the email. And it had a feature that would make sure that would validate the links. Well, how did it do that? Well, I sent out 50,000 emails. Well, 50,000 times it goes to that particular link. Well, if it's the same link, or at least it's the same, host name, it may be in the URL, it might be a little different. But if the service that is checking those links, well, if I have one IP address sends 50,000 requests to check the validity of a particular link in an email, the WAF's going to say, well, wait a minute, that's a lot of requests coming from one IP address. That can't possibly be legitimate traffic. Well, it's not legitimate unless we know ahead of time that there's a service that performs that function. We can absolutely program the WAF to be aware of that kind of traffic coming in and not, we won't, block that traffic. We might need to throttle it though, because maybe the back-end web server can't handle that much traffic all at once. The WAF can handle it, but maybe that would overwhelm the back-end web server. So there's lots of things that we can do to make sure that the WAF is fitting in to the larger cybersecurity infrastructure, right? But yeah, Nate, that's a great example of how we have to make sure that the WAF fits into the larger, the larger field of, the cybersecurity infrastructure overall.
Yeah, and I think there's one thing I was going to kind of mention as well that I think you kind of glossed over, I would say almost too easily, and it was just about some of Barracuda's functionality. I think one of the things that I like about your Barracuda WAF is that, oftentimes for, people listening to this, right, they're not always technical. And so the question is going to be, well, what should my settings be? You said, it's enterprise level. I can fine tune things. I don't know what I don't know. That's why I'm trying to engage with you on this. And so I think one of the things I really like about the Barracuda is that you have the kind of a detect mode and block mode. So you can put into that detect mode and just analyze what's coming in first, right? And then from the different modules that you've enabled for your website, it'll actually start giving you recommendations saying, based off of all the network activity that we see coming into your website, maybe this value needs to be 320 and this one should be set to this. And so you're not coming in just saying, I'm just going to set it at 500 and figure out what happens. I don't know what that actually means, but allowing the tool to at least guide you through that implementation does make it a lot easier. And so I think that's also where the difference between these basic, WAFs where there is no guidance into one of these other ones where that both the tool and, if you partner with someone like CIT, we can work together between the two and get you a tuned solution fairly quickly without all the complexities that you would have if you just went with, kind of an off the shelf or open source type of solution, right? So
yeah,
really big difference.
That's a great point. Yeah, that is. And you make a good point too. We rely on our Barracuda partners to do a lot of the communication with the end user. You know your end users better than we do because you have that relationship with them on many levels. We may talk to them about a specific product or specific solution, but you know their business better than we do. But we're certainly happy to come in and join that conversation. However, you brought up a good point about how do we handle the fine tuning process, the onboarding process, and how do you know what your settings should be? The way I like to do. I've been doing this for close to 9 years now, and what I like to do is as much testing as I can before I press the big red button, right? You turn the DNS over and point it at the WAF, right? You turn the WAF on. What I like to do is I like to find the person who knows the application well. Go to that person and go to their host file. Usually they're on a Windows computer, and we set the host file to point the domain name to the WAF. Who would tell that person, go to the application, open it up, do everything you would normally do in the application in your browser. Click around, do everything that is legitimate that you would do as much as you possibly can, right? And if there's a specific time where that individual does that, we know the time frame, we know their public IP address, we can go back to the WAF logs, we look at the time frame, we look at their IP address, and anything in the firewall logs that the WAF said, hey, I didn't like this traffic, I didn't like that traffic. Well, we know that person ostensibly is not doing any attacks, right? So right there, you have a really good idea of what you need to do to tune your application. Now, maybe that you're new to a WAF, so you're like, I'm not sure exactly how to tune the WAF. So we got a couple of things there. One is we have a thing called mark as false positive, which is a nice tool for a number of the firewall logs that you have. You click on it and it'll pop up and give you some information. Here's what we recommend you do in this particular case. That's one thing we can do. But we also recommend that if they're already engaged with you as your trusted, your cybersecurity partner, then we highly recommend that our end users engage with somebody like you guys who know this. They know the space, you know the product, you understand how it works. Even a little bit of training will go a long way. Right. But once we've tuned it and we're pretty sure that it's not doing any false positives, the next thing we do is we flip the DNS over. Now all the traffic is coming in. Again, we do the same thing. We don't put it in blocking mode yet. We just watch the logs. Are we seeing any firewall log entries? And we'll examine those firewall log entries and look for possible false positives. If we see any, we'll tune them. But if we don't see any after maybe a day or two, depending on what your comfort level is in operating without the WAF in blocking mode, is we turn on blocking mode. And again, we just kind of observe the firewall logs and see what happens. Do we get any reports of people saying, "Hey, what's going on here? I used to be able to go to this page and do this, and now I can't." And then we go in and find out, oh, it's very common that an end user will do something that we didn't think of when we were doing our testing. It happens all the time, right? But it's pretty easy for us to go in there and tune those. And once we tune it, the number of false positives drops off very rapidly. After a couple of days, we've filtered all of those out, and then we just watch it. Maybe once or twice in the coming weeks, somebody reports, "Hey, something unusual happened." We go in, we tweak the settings a little bit, and then from there, it's not quite set it and forget it, but it is as close to that as you can get, right? And then so you only need to go in there when something's wrong, or what we could do is we could proactively send reports out. Maybe every week we send out some reports to alert the administrator of here's a summary of what we blocked, right? Here's the most common clients that were sending requests that got blocked. And then maybe there's one IP address in there that sent hundreds of thousands of blocked requests. And maybe you want to investigate, well, what is that IP address? Who's doing that? Every now and again, I'll run into a case where one of those IP addresses has a whole bunch of blocked entries. And it turns out it's a partner doing API traffic and something went wrong. And there's just an oddball. There's just an edge case that we need to address, but we didn't catch it because it wasn't obvious that something was going wrong until we were looking at the logs. But it's things like that where the end user may not know what they need to be doing to test all that. Whereas you as an expert in the field, you could definitely help them know what to look for when they're deploying the WAF and they're doing the follow-up in the days and weeks after the deployment to make sure that everything's working okay.
Yeah, that was exactly my next question, was just sort of how all this works. So clearly this is a part of your cybersecurity layer, but we've been talking a lot off the podcast about compliance. And I'm interested if, how this ties into your compliance strategy, especially for like healthcare and finance and manufacturing, all these really regulated industries. What does this mean for them?
Yeah, and that's another good question, because a WAF is often a layer of the security that needs to be met for compliance. Let's take a PCI DSS. That's a classic one, right? There's no such thing as a PCI compliant WAF, right? Because that doesn't exist. However, a WAF is necessary to get PCI compliance. So if I deploy if my cardholder data environment, CDE, maybe I want everything on my prem. I don't want to put anything in the cloud. I want everything on a prem or in a data center that I control. Well, I could deploy a WAF appliance as part of the network stack and then the security stack in my data center. Well, the WAF is a necessary element to being PCI compliant. But the WAF, you can't deploy a WAF and then say, I'm now PCI compliant. What you can say is, I've deployed a WAF. It checks all of the boxes in if you look at the PCI specifications, there's several sections in there that say you need a WAF and the WAF needs to do this, this, and this, right? And so Well, our WAF does all of those things, right? And so now you probably have a third party that will come in and they will audit your CDE, your cardholder data environment, and then that third party will say, okay, now you're compliant. But the WAF will be part of the overall compliance picture. There's a lot of things that need to be checked for an environment to be PCI compliant. WAF fits into that. So it's not a silver bullet, right? But it is part of the process of making an environment PCI compliant. Now, for the cloud introduces some interesting dynamics, right? Because if you have a cloud-based WAF, well, now all of a sudden that cloud-based WAF becomes part of a CDE if cardholder data is flowing through the WAF out in the cloud, right? And that's a scenario where the WAF itself isn't necessarily PCI compliant, but the environment that the WAF operates in, that needs to be PCI compliant, right? So you have cloud-based WAFs. Well, you need to make sure that the cloud-based WAF is PCI compliant if you're going to have cardholder data flowing through that WAF, right? So that's one of the things that you want to take care to make sure you do. HIPAA is another one of those things where it's like, no, there's not a HIPAA compliant WAF, but a WAF can help you be HIPAA compliant. It's another one of those things where a WAF is another piece of the cybersecurity infrastructure that lets your environment meet these compliancy requirements.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things, so talking about just the larger picture is also just the visibility, right? Most people just assume that there's not much happening on the website, but once you put in a WAF, even into just a visibility mode, it's amazing how many attacks actually come to the website every single day. I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but I remember when I was looking at our website, again, CT, we're not big, we're not super well known. And I think it was something like 34,000 different attacks against our website every day. And part of that is just bots, right? They're coming through, they're just testing for which vulnerabilities exist. There's security researchers who are trying to identify, are there vulnerabilities so I can do a responsible disclosure? There are actual threat actors that are trying to do the same to exploit them. And there's other just vulnerability scanning tools that are just happening, out on the internet all day. So like thinking about kind of like network traffic, typically people will think about, oh, well, this is just my environment. It's pretty secure, right? Not much going on. But if you think about the public internet, it's kind of like looking at the ocean, right? There are waves and network traffic like everywhere. Everything is chaotic out in the middle of the ocean. It's only where you see at your, spot what's truly happening. But the public internet is a very chaotic, environment where everyone is almost always scanning, on all days, every day. So it's one of those ones where I wanted to bring it up because when people consider a WAF, it's like, man, why would I even do that? Right? Yes, I have the website, and maybe these couple custom vibe coded applications. We talked about the security risks of that, but it's the visibility is oftentimes you don't know what you don't know. But as soon as you put a WAF in place and you see everything that's happening, I mean, people are constantly trying to brute force into a WordPress website or a vulnerable plugin, right? We see what notifications, and disclosures all the time about there's another, 15 different WordPress plugins that are exploited and to give you access to the full website. That's where those WAFs come into play. But until you see that, data, oftentimes it's like a unknown risk that hasn't been uncovered yet.
Yeah, that I like that. The internet, it's got a very Wild West feel to it, right? Because traffic can come from pretty much anywhere on the planet, right? So you want to make sure that you're protecting your website. We like to do, where possible, we like to do geofencing. Right? One of the nice things about geofencing is that if you know your legitimate customers are only in North America or North American Europe or particular geography, or if you know that you will never have legitimate customers coming from certain countries that might be the high risk countries, the North Korea, countries where there are known bad actors, known state actors, we could block based on geography, which is one layer of protection. One of the things I like about doing the geofencing is that that decision is made at layer 3. Right? We're like, okay, that traffic came from an IP address we don't like. Great. We're not going to spend all the time going through and decrypting the packet, inspecting the payload, looking for all of these different kinds of attacks because we know it came from a source we don't trust. So we're going to block it. And we can, of course, make other layer 3 decisions. For example, if we have IP block lists, for example. We know that certain IP addresses are at certain times sending attack traffic. Well, as long as they're on the, you might call it an RBL, right? That's a block list. We're going to disallow that traffic as long as that IP address is on the block list. So there's things you could do at layer 3, and IP, the geofencing is one of the things. Tor exit nodes, we can block those as well. So there's certain things that you could do at layer 3. I like that. One of the other things you mentioned was visibility. I really appreciate visibility. A lot of our customers, they've spun up an IIS server on a Windows machine, put it behind their Cisco firewall or their Palo firewall, and they think it's good. And they're not really looking at their logs. And they don't realize what's going on. But we put a WAF in place. Suddenly you have visibility into what's happening. And the amount of there's outright attack traffic, like you mentioned, but just the nuisance traffic. There's an inordinate amount of nuisance traffic, right? We want to block all of that. One of the reasons I tell people why they should have a WAF, not just for security, but your application server, those logs become much more meaningful when that nuisance traffic is filtered out, right? So when you go on your IIS logs, if you've blocked out all of the bad stuff, then those logs are more meaningful, right? Because ostensibly their only real legit traffic is coming through. Right? So there's other reasons why we want to have that network or that application layer protection in front of those web servers.
Perfect. Well, I think we got an amazing overview. I just want to give you both an opportunity to share any last minute comments about this. Anything else we did not cover that you really want to make sure gets covered?
Well, I'd like to share just an example story. It's an anecdote, right? But it illustrates where a Barracuda WAF as a service can really fit in nicely in some situations. We had a scenario where we had a credit union kind of the western side of the country. And what was happening with them is they had everything in-house on-prem. They had their own internal data center. They had their own firewall. They had their own web servers. And what happened was they started receiving DDoS attacks, right? So they were just being overwhelmed with, it was a volumetric DDoS attack, just sending too much traffic for their server to be able to handle. So they went into their perimeter firewall and said, oh, there's the IP address that's going to block it. So they blocked that IP address. Website worked for a couple minutes and then it went down again because the attacker switched source IP address. And now the website is down again. All right, so they blocked that next IP address. Well, what was happening was they were playing this game of whack-a-mole for about a week. When somehow they reached out to us, I think they were like, we can't keep doing this, and we helped them with other things for cybersecurity. So they reached out to us, and we said, well, let's try this. We'll spin up a WAF as a service trial, right? So it takes about 15, 20 minutes to spin up a trial. But once it's up and running, we could point traffic at a WAF as a service. So we switched their DNS over to a WAF as a service. And then we just turned it on. We didn't spend a lot of time fine tuning because their site was basically down. So a false positive is very low impact compared to the site being completely down, right? So we pointed at the WAF as a service, we turned it on, and we started doing fine tuning. But the moment we switched the DNS over to the WAF as a service, the attack stopped immediately. It was immediately mitigated. So that tells you that having application security is really important. And your network firewall can help, but it's not designed for certain kinds of things, right? Yes, the network firewall could block an IP address, but what it could not do is know which IP addresses to block, right? So that's where that illustrates the difference between the network firewall and the web application firewall. The web application firewall is a specialist for this kind of traffic and this kind of attack. And once we got the right security solution in place, everything came back, and the price, they signed the PO like that day, right? Because they realized just the investment was so low compared to the value that it brought, right? And so we have a lot of customers who are in that situation where getting application security doesn't have to be complicated, and it doesn't have to be overly expensive. Right? They just need to know that it's there, and it can happen quickly and relatively easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To answer your question here, I think the one thing that I just wanted to kind of close on was, again, kind of going back to why I was thinking about having this podcast in the first place is everyone has a website that they should be at least considering protecting, even if it's just to prevent things like defacement. The other one was really the rise of all the vibe coding, right? And just saying, we know that people vibe coded and did not put the strong security analysis and review into the applications before they started making them public. You go look at the reports online, and they are finding vulnerable vibe coding applications all over the place. I think one of the last metrics that I saw was like at least 60% of vibe coded applications were discovered to have some type of vulnerability in the application. So it's well known that they are vulnerable. So how do you protect against those? So that's ultimately why we wanted to do that. So if you are an organization that's just curious about, how do we prevent defacement, but if really the ones that I really wanted to hope would listen in on this, podcast was, if you've been vibe coding and you love AI, this is something you need to consider,
Yeah.
Barracuda.
Yeah. So Nate, where do you guys sit with things like vulnerability scanning and penetration testing at the application layer? Do you provide those services for customers to help them to see, where a deployed application might have security vulnerabilities?
Yeah, CIT can assist with that as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic thing to do, because if you have an application and you're not sure what it needs, or if you have an application, and here's something that I think a lot of our customers might know about. They have an application that they're not self-hosting. They have a third-party host. They have a Vercel or some other host, or they're in AWS or Azure. They're somewhere, and there is a cloud-native WAF option that is relatively inexpensive compared to an enterprise-grade solution. How do they know that it's working? Well, I think CIT would be able to come to them and say, here, let's do an analysis. There's vulnerability scanning, and then there's penetration testing, right? There's two layers, like how aggressive do we want to be? But if we can get a non-prod environment and do pen testing and really hit it hard looking for vulnerabilities, you're going to find out if the cloud native WAF solution that is provided by the web hosting entity, is it really going to get the job done for your application? In some cases it will, in some cases it will not. And you want to know about that ahead of time before an attack.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, we've talked about how important those assessments are, how important the visibility is. And then, of course, what you already mentioned about Barracuda WAF having that flexibility and ability for the admin to really have the controls that they need. So perfect.
Yes. And one of the things that we can do too is, Barracuda, what we have is we have a WAF appliance. It could be a hardware appliance, which is not as common. I think you guys know hardware appliances are not the most common thing nowadays, but we still have use cases for a hardware appliance. Much more often, though, we would have a use case for a virtualized appliance, right? And so maybe, a company likes to have things on-prem or in a data center, and they control it, and they have a robust, virtualized environment. It could be Proxmox. I know a lot of people are moving away from VMware. That's understandable. What we can do is we can supply a WAF appliance that could run in a virtualized environment. And that's relatively easy to get set up because we could do a trial license. You could spin it up and you could try it and see, does it work for this environment? Is it going to meet your needs? And it's not, you don't have to make a big investment just to determine if a WAF appliance will meet your needs on-prem. However, it's even easier to do a WAF as a service. It's a cloud hosted WAF. That is very simple to get started. So if you wanted to try, hey, I want to see what a cloud-based WAF looks like in front of one of my applications, very easy to do. We could do that in less than an hour. So those options are out there. So we want people to know that we can do this, and we can do it relatively quickly and relatively easily to make sure that if you want to find out, will a WAF work for me? Do I need it? Is it going to work? How much is it going to cost? We could definitely help people get those answers quickly.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. Of course, I'll have all of your information in our description, so check that out. If you want to get in contact with Nate or Michael, we can definitely do that. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Ariel. Nate, thank you very much for having me. I love talking about this subject.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this topic, please let us know. Like, subscribe, or reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.